The first morning Olivia Bennett officially ran the company. She walked into the operations center and saw a man asleep at his desk. His head rested on his forearms, surrounded by 24 monitors alive with scrolling alerts. She did not ask questions. She did not check the screens. She did not give him a single moment to open his mouth. In front of the entire technical floor, she ordered his access badge confiscated and ended his employment on the spot. Andrew Foster had barely lifted his head when she cut him off completely. Only hours later, as the payment infrastructure began collapsing layer by layer, would Olivia understand that the man she had just fired was the only reason the company had survived the previous 48 hours. Aurelius Pay was not a company where a few slow minutes were a minor inconvenience. It was a large financial technology firm that processed corporate payments, high-speed wire transfers, and transaction authentication for thousands of clients across the United States. The system ran without meaningful pause, and even a brief failure carried the potential for tens of millions of dollars in losses and the kind of reputational damage that took years to repair. The infrastructure was the company. Everything else was window dressing built around it. Andrew Foster carried the title of Senior Systems Engineer, though that title communicated almost nothing about what he actually did. He was 34 years old, quiet in the way that people who have seen enough stop needing to announce themselves, and entirely uninterested in the internal politics that consumed most of his colleagues. New employees who encountered him usually assumed he was unremarkable, solid but dated, always slightly rumpled, eyes carrying the faint darkness of chronic undersleep, a cold cup of coffee perpetually forgotten near his keyboard. He was not a man who understood the art of making himself visible. The people who had worked alongside him for years held a different understanding. Andrew knew Aurelius Pay's infrastructure the way a surgeon knows a patient they have operated on multiple times. He understood the old API layers that dated back nearly a decade, the failover logic that 3 different CTOs had promised to modernize and never had, the access control structures that had been patched by hand across multiple transitions, and the fragile interdependencies that existed only because someone once built a solution to a problem that no longer existed, but whose removal would have caused something worse. He was the institutional memory the company had never bothered to formally document. To the organization, he was a line on an org chart. To the system itself, he was the only person who truly knew where all the load-bearing walls were. Outside the office, Andrew was the sole parent of Chloe Foster, a 7-year-old who was quiet and perceptive, old enough in her manner to occasionally unsettle adults who expected children to be simple. His wife had died several years earlier after a prolonged illness. Since then, Andrew had rebuilt a life around 2 fixed points: keeping Chloe cared for and keeping his job stable enough that she never felt the absence of anything essential. He did not cultivate allies inside the company. He did not know how to perform the small social rituals that turned colleagues into advocates. He showed up, he worked, he went home. That was the shape of his life, and he had made a kind of peace with it. On the other side of the hierarchy stood Olivia Bennett, 29 years old, recently installed as chief executive after her grandfather stepped back from management due to declining health. Olivia was legitimately accomplished, sharp, well-credentialed, with a track record in investment analysis and corporate strategy that she had earned rather than inherited. She had spent years proving herself in rooms where people expected her to fail. But leading Aurelius Pay was categorically different from anything she had done before. This was a complex, aging, high-stakes operational machine, and she was stepping into it during a transition the company had not fully prepared for. The pressure to prove she was not merely a name on a family tree was enormous, and it shaped every instinct she brought to the role. She made decisions quickly and decisively, and she despised visible indiscipline. It reminded her of everything she was determined to eliminate. In her first week, she announced a comprehensive operational review, a tightening of standards, and a cultural reset she described as moving the company from comfortable to accountable. Beneath the surface of that agenda, in the lower corridors of the technical infrastructure that Olivia had not yet had time to fully examine, something had already begun to go wrong. 2 days before the morning that would define everything, Andrew noticed something unusual in the transaction authentication logs. It was small at first, a cluster of irregular requests appearing at low frequency within the international processing queue, mimicking the rhythm of legitimate internal traffic with enough precision that automated filters had dismissed them entirely. But Andrew saw it. The pattern was wrong, in a way that was difficult to articulate immediately, but impossible to ignore once recognized. These requests were not attempting to overwhelm the system or trigger visible errors. They were learning it. He traced the activity backward and identified a deliberate, methodical intrusion. Someone had obtained access to a secondary service at the edge of the architecture, a low-priority authentication relay that handled a narrow subset of cross-border payment verifications. From that foothold, they had been quietly probing deeper, testing what the relay could reach, establishing a path toward more central systems. Their goal was not immediate destruction. They were waiting for the right moment to intervene in a high-volume processing window, redirect funds, or disable the reconciliation mechanisms entirely. Andrew escalated through his direct manager. The manager, acutely aware of how poorly timed a major incident report would land the day before a new CEO took the helm, asked Andrew to continue monitoring and avoid creating alarm before anything was confirmed. The message, politely delivered, was essentially a request to stay quiet and hope the problem resolved itself. Andrew did not comply in any meaningful sense. He began building temporary isolation barriers around the segments he had identified as compromised. He constructed manual redirect layers to absorb suspicious traffic without triggering visible failures. He hot-patched individual nodes, working through the architecture the way someone shores up a sinking structure not with blueprints and proper materials, but with whatever was at hand, done with enough care to hold. The difficulty was that the infrastructure was ancient in technology terms, accumulated through years of partial upgrades and emergency fixes, and there was no safe way to take it offline and clean it. Keeping the company operational while defending it simultaneously meant working without a net on a live system with no margin for significant error. The 48 hours that followed were the kind of sustained endurance that most people never experience. Andrew barely left the operations floor. He drank whatever coffee was available, ate from vending machines, and changed his shirt in the technical staff bathroom near midnight. His colleagues saw him there continuously, registering his presence the way people register a familiar fixture, assuming he was managing a routine escalation. Nobody understood the scale of what he was actually doing. Andrew was not patching a bug. He was keeping an entire system alive through sheer will, experience, and the kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be transferred in a briefing. Late in the second night, he discovered something that shifted the situation from serious to existential. The attackers had embedded a delayed activation mechanism inside the core processing cluster, a dormant trigger that would remain invisible during normal operations, but would fire automatically if anyone performed a standard system restart. Under ordinary circumstances, a restart was routine maintenance, used constantly to clear memory accumulation and resynchronize services. If anyone performed that restart without knowing about the trigger, every temporary defensive layer Andrew had built would collapse, the dormant pathway would open, and the attack would enter its active phase. Andrew wrote it all down. He built a file of technical notes, time-stamped log summaries, patch annotations, and explicit warnings. He intended to deliver them directly to executive leadership in the morning, regardless of what that required in terms of bypassing normal channels. He was going to make someone understand, but the body has limits that override intention when pushed past them, and Andrew had been running for nearly 2 full days without real sleep. Sitting before the running log display, waiting for the morning shift to arrive, he put his head down for one moment and did not come back up. Olivia arrived at the operations center at 7:45 as part of a self-directed tour of the company's critical infrastructure. She wanted to see the organization without filters, without the prepared presentations department heads would have assembled for a formal walkthrough. She walked through the cold, brightly lit floor, past rows of monitors and tired engineers finishing overnight shifts, and stopped when she reached the center console. A man in a wrinkled shirt was asleep at his desk. The screens around him were active, a mix of status indicators, amber warnings, and fast-scrolling log output that meant nothing to her without context. What Olivia saw was a symbol of everything she had come to change. A person sleeping at the most sensitive station in the company's infrastructure was an indictment of the culture she was inheriting, careless, unaccountable, self-satisfied. She did not pause to interpret the monitors. She looked at the badge holder on the desk, read the name, and called it out clearly. Andrew jolted upright. For several seconds, he was genuinely disoriented, head heavy, eyes dry and painful, ears filled with a low ringing as his body fought back toward consciousness. He had not yet fully located himself when Olivia spoke again, and the words landed with a sharpness that cut through the fog. This company does not pay anyone to sleep on the job. Every engineer in earshot stopped moving. Andrew steadied himself, recognized the woman from the company announcement he had seen the previous week, and understood immediately what he was dealing with. He spoke before she could continue. "You need to hear what I have to say about the core payment cluster. Please don't." Olivia cut across him without hesitation. "I don't need to hear anything on my first morning. Security, collect his access card. HR, initiate termination immediately." Andrew looked at her not with fear, not with desperation, but with the specific urgency of someone watching a preventable disaster approach. He tried once more. If someone restarts the system, Olivia had already turned her attention to the security officer moving toward him. "I've said everything I'm going to say." The room stayed silent. Several engineers who had been on shift for hours, who knew Andrew had been there nearly the entire time, said nothing. Speaking against the new chief executive in her first hour would have been a professional act of extraordinary boldness that none of them could bring themselves to perform. Andrew removed his badge slowly, without argument. He did not raise his voice. He did not list what he had done. He asked for nothing. Before he walked out, he looked at a younger engineer named Daniel, standing nearby, and said 4 words clearly enough for several people to hear. "Do not restart it." Someone thought he was being dramatic. Someone else assumed it was the bitter parting remark of a man who felt wronged. Olivia did not register it as anything meaningful at all. She had already filed the morning as a necessary act of leadership, the first clean signal that the era of comfortable negligence was over. Andrew left the building at the pace of a man with nothing left in his legs. He had not been given a single opportunity to share what he knew. He did not know whether the warning he had managed to leave behind would be enough. After Andrew left, the operations floor continued functioning. The dashboards looked manageable from a surface reading. The isolation layers he had installed overnight were quietly absorbing irregular traffic, keeping the most sensitive processes stable in a way that was invisible unless you understood what you were looking at. To Olivia and the supervisors joining her morning briefings, the system running